Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Solney, a contributor to Atlantic Live, and we're glad you're joining us for the State of Education Rebuilding a More Equitable System. The pandemic's toll on our education system has resulted in academic regressions that are more troubling than initially expected. And our most vulnerable learners, the students of color, those from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and students with additional learning needs, are suffering the most. The pandemic has made existing disparities worse, but it's also presenting a unique opportunity to dramatically overhaul our education system. Over the next hour, we're going to talk about the American K through 12 and higher education systems, and we'll outline solutions that should be implemented to create an equitable learning environment for all students. We want to invite all of you watching to be part of the conversation by submitting your questions via the chat function. Our first session will be a conversation with Atlantic staff writer Adam Harris and John King, President and CEO of the Education Trust and former Secretary of Education for the Obama administration. But before we begin, we'll hear from Dr. Nadia Lopez, founding principal of the Mott Hall Bridges Academy in Brooklyn, New York. She'll tell us about the difficulties many students and teachers faced this pandemic year of learning and about their hope for an equity-centered overhaul of our education system.
Learning during the pandemic could be summarized in 3 words: exhaustive, challenging, and impossible. Now, while we could have never fully prepared for a global health crisis of this magnitude, our educators, teachers who were in our classrooms, simply did not have the skills in order to provide virtual instruction. And even more disheartening, because of inequities, children living in marginalized communities simply did not have the technologies needed to access online learning. And the consequence is that the academic gaps that they already face are widening exponentially. There are traumas that both adults and children are dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and that is also affecting teaching and learning. Now, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because right now we have a new administration with a First Lady who understands education from a K through 16 model, and we also have a Secretary of Education who knows public schools. And so I know that there's a sense of urgency to get our kids back into our classrooms, but also providing the funding that will be needed for professional development, as well as mental health support, and giving our schools all of the equipment that they need for equitable spaces to be part of their future.
I'm Adam Harris, a staff writer with The Atlantic, and I'd like to welcome John King, President and CEO of the Education Trust and former Secretary of Education for the Obama administration. Thank you so much for joining me, John. Before we begin, we'd like to invite our audience to join the conversation. Please submit your questions via the chat function. So, John, as we just heard in that video from Principal Lopez, this has been a difficult year for administrators and students alike. There's a lot of emphasis on reopening schools, but beyond PPE and funding, what needs to fundamentally change as school districts across the country reopen?
Look, I think we really have to go back and look at February 2020 and acknowledge that it's not just good enough to go back to how things were, that we had profound inequities in our system, inequities for low-income students and students of color in particular, where as a country, we were giving the least to the students who need the most. Low-income students and students of color before COVID were getting less access to quality early childhood education, less access to resources, funding levels significantly below their more affluent peers. We showed at Ed Trust in a study, we spent about $2,000 less per student in the districts that serve the largest numbers of students of color compared to those that serve the fewest. Less access to strong teachers, less access to counselors, less access to advanced coursework like AP classes or algebra in the 8th grade, less access to support around post-secondary transitions. And we see similar inequities in our higher education system. States that significantly underinvest in public higher education, underinvest dramatically in community colleges relative to their flagship universities. So to my mind, we really have to see this as an opportunity to build a much more just future as we return to school.
And prior to the pandemic, as you mentioned, we weren't living up to the kind of ideals of America's educational system. Majority non-white school districts received about $23 billion less in funding than majority white school districts. So, when the pandemic began, students of color, low-income students, rural students, and others often lacked, those basic needs to participate in remote learning, laptops, Wi-Fi. So, how do we fix that inequity going forward?
Yeah. Well, in the immediate, we have to respond to the learning challenges and socio-emotional challenges that Nadia described in the video. McKinsey projects a 6 to 12 month learning loss for low-income students and students of color as a result of the disruptions to school. So how do we respond to that? I think we need a significant investment in tutoring. I'd love to see a national tutoring corps mobilizing recent college graduates, retired teachers to help students catch up. We ought to invest in summer learning. Randy Weingarten, the president of the AFT, and I wrote an op-ed last spring calling for a major federal investment in summer. Summer 21, summer 22 will need to have a mix of academics and enrichment, things like arts and athletics and so forth. And we'll need to invest in mental health services and counselors because this whole period has taken a real toll on students. Socio-emotional well-being. They've been isolated from school. So if we do those things, that will help us get kids back successfully. But then we've really got to tackle fundamental reforms to how we fund our schools and to how we allocate resources, whether it's teachers or courses or even seats in our public higher ed institutions, which are sadly today quite inequitable, where low-income students and students of color are overwhelmingly concentrated in community colleges and regional publics and not getting access to flagship universities.
And I actually kind of wanted to focus on that need for robust summer programs that you were just mentioning, because it's interesting in this moment where we do need the additional summer resources. The economic downturn has cut tax revenue for many cities and states. State and local funding was absent from the last COVID relief bill. There was some money for education, and in this upcoming relief plan that President Biden has proposed, there is some money for state and local governments. But how can state and local governments, school districts address those funding shortages in education when they also need to do things like have robust summer programming?
Yeah. Well, we need the federal government to step in. And look, the reality is the federal government can borrow, states can't. And so we need the federal government to provide significant aid to school districts as well as to state and local governments. And the good news is President Biden has made those proposals to Congress. They're working through them, and I'm hopeful that we'll see significant stimulus. He proposed $1.9 trillion. If we see that kind of investment, that will make a huge difference in protecting against cuts to schools. Now, that said, we also think it's important to have provisions in the federal law that make it clear that if you are getting these additional federal dollars, you must protect your highest needs districts from cuts. What we saw during the last recession, even though there were federal stimulus dollars, we still saw significant cuts that had a disproportionate negative impact on our highest needs kids. So there's an opportunity here for Congress, I think, to make a huge difference.
Yeah. And do you think that President Biden's relief plan does enough to address the needs of schools nationwide? And if so, can you just kind of tell us how and why it would help?
Yeah. Well, he's proposed $130 billion for K-12. That would go a long way to addressing some of the things we need to do to safely reopen, like paying for testing, personal protective equipment, ventilation upgrades. That also would provide funding that could go to tutoring and to summer and to additional mental health supports. So that's good. That will help. That's a good down payment. But my hope is that after this first package passes, that there'll be a second package that will make a much more significant federal investment in our highest needs schools. President Biden talked during the campaign about potentially tripling Title I, the main federal funding stream that goes to schools serving low-income students. That would be hugely helpful in closing that $23 billion gap that you described. He also talked during the campaign about doubling Pell Grants. As you know very well, Adam, Pell Grants back in 1980 accounted for about 80% of the cost of public four-year college. Today, Pell Grants account for about 28%. So a doubling of Pell Grants would go a long way to making college much more accessible for low-income and moderate-income students.
And just as a reminder to the audience, you can submit questions via the chat function. We have one from Vanessa Denny, the principal at Early College High School. She asked, how should we balance the need to respond to students' immediate learning and social emotional needs while planning for fundamental education and systemic reform? And where is the balance there?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think within school districts, you really need folks to be targeted to each of those issues. So you need folks who are managing the immediate, getting schools safely reopened, setting up tutoring in summer for summer programs for those students who are behind, making sure that every student has a meaningful, positive relationship with an adult at school, which is central to kids' success and well-being. And then you need someone else, can't be the same person. You need someone else who's charged for the district with thinking about what's our long-term plan. Once we get back into buildings, how are we going to tackle our equity challenges? How are we going to make sure that our curriculum is high quality, that we have a culturally responsive curriculum? How are we going to tackle teacher diversity? Majority of our kids are kids of color. Only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color. We ought to be thinking about grow your own programs and better retention supports to keep our teachers of color. But you can't have the same person thinking about that who's right now figuring out how to make sure school's able to open back up over the next few weeks. So you've got to dedicate resources to those long-term questions. But we can't afford to let this moment pass without taking on these deeper structural challenges.
And actually, to that point, do you see a scenario where we keep anything that we have learned from this past year, where we say we keep the hybrid model where you can kind of work or learn from anywhere, and is that more likely to stay around in higher ed than K-12? I guess, what do you see us keeping from this last year?
Yeah. Three things that I think we will keep. One is we've done a lot of work across the country because of heroic leadership by school districts and principals and teachers to get kids devices and internet access and comfortable with using technology. So I hope that we've learned some lessons about how technology can be a tool to support student learning in K-12 and in higher ed, and I hope we'll keep that. I hope we'll still see places where the teacher says, we're learning about the ancient pyramids, so we're going to use technology to actually go inside and explore the ancient pyramids. We're doing this science experiment, but we're going to actually test out different models of that experiment using technology, right? So there's that opportunity. I think there's an opportunity to say we can never again say to students, you can't take that class because it's not offered in this building. We know we have big disparities for Black and Latino students in access to things like AP courses. Well, just because AP Spanish isn't offered in your building doesn't mean you can't take it, because you could take it through an online blended learning opportunity. So that's another important takeaway from this period. A third is some school districts, and I think you'll hear about this from Dr. Santelises from Baltimore later, some school districts have experimented with deploying teachers differently, where the teacher who's really effective at teaching a particular lesson on fractions is doing that for the whole fifth grade, and other teachers then are free to use that time to work with small groups of students or to look at student work. And so those creative arrangements about how we deploy teacher time and talent are something hopefully that we'll learn from and carry forward.
We have another question from the audience. It's from Marianne Puri, who says she's a former TAC member. The kids I'm most concerned about are those that we've literally lost for a year? How do we reach out to them, offer them resources, and get them reintegrated into schools in the fall? And where do they go?
Yeah. I mean, we're going to need to leverage partners. I think about organizations like City Year that have worked very effectively with struggling high schools to help them engage students, build positive relationships with mentors that help make school a place they want to be. I think about programs like Building Assets, Reducing Risks out of Minnesota, which was started by a school counselor, where teams of teachers and counselors meet every week about every student and figure out what are they good at, what are their strengths, what are their assets that we can leverage, but also who needs intervention and which adult on the team is going to make sure that intervention happens. So we need strategies like that. We're going to need to invest some of that $130 billion in this re-engagement work. And that may mean needing to change how school is designed for some kids. Some kids have had to work and may need to continue to work. So can we have creative scheduling that helps them to be able to do that? Can we think about career and technical education programs that might help students see the immediate connection between what they're doing in high school and what they want to do professionally? So we're going to have to work very hard. We cannot afford to have a lost generation of students.
We've talked a little bit about higher ed, and the path to college looks very different for many students given the financial ripple effects of the pandemic. I read something the other day that was saying, essentially community colleges, students who are going to go to community colleges were probably going to be the most likely not to attend when the financial kind of ripple effects of the pandemic happen. And your organization, the Education Trust, is an advocate for post-secondary education. So how are you all working to address these new circumstances high school students are facing, and kind of what can be done to better support those students to make sure their dreams of attending colleges aren't indefinitely deferred?
Yeah, I'm very worried about this. I mean, we already see community college enrollment is down by more than 10%, and we see a significant drop in the enrollment of first-time students. So a few things we need to do. One, we have to work really hard to make sure that every high school student who's eligible for financial aid completes the free application for federal student aid, the FAFSA. Every year, students leave billions of dollars on the table that could help them go to college because they didn't complete the FAFSA. Every high school should be figuring out now who still hasn't completed the FAFSA and how do we make sure that they get that done. We're seeing in a lot of states a dip in FAFSA completion. That's a bad sign. We need high school seniors to do that, and we need college students to do it for the next academic year. Then in our community colleges, we need resources. Federal assistance will help here from the $1.9 trillion relief package. States need to step up here. Many students are leaving school or decide not to go to school because they can't afford it. It's not just tuition. It's the cost of housing, of books, of food. We need more aid for students. Again, doubling Pell Grants would help tremendously. And we need more supports for students. We need to provide better advising, better counseling, access to childcare on campus. A fifth of our students are parents. How are we helping them to navigate college? What are we doing to help folks around the cost of transportation? We've really got to have a holistic view. And as you know, Adam, and have written about, when colleges put in place those kinds of supports, they not only enroll low-income students and students of color at higher rates, but they actually complete at higher rates. And we need a lot more programs like that.
Yeah. Jeff Austin said, I'm a high school principal in Los Angeles. We're trying to revamp our grading and assessment policies to make them more equitable, but we are a bit roadblocked because universities want traditional letter grades. How can secondary schools partner with universities to change this antiquated system of evaluating students? And I actually, I kind of dovetails with the question I wanted to ask was, should four-year colleges and universities sort of redefine the academic merit in the college acceptance process?
Well, certainly we're seeing colleges already making adaptations given the consequences of COVID. I hope some of those will stick. We really want to have a comprehensive picture of student performance. when we're making decisions about admissions. We don't want to make the decision based on any one indicator. And I think colleges have taken a more holistic approach this year. That's a good thing. We need colleges to be very thoughtful about the equity implications of the choices they make. I'll give you one example. People may be surprised to know that in many of our selective admission colleges, they have an underrepresentation of Black and Latino students. Despite all the rhetoric against affirmative action, we actually have an underrepresentation of students of color in those selective admission colleges. The thing that gets you the most kind of boost in admissions in many of those institutions is playing a sport. And particularly, again, people think that's going to be basketball or football. No, it's actually in many elite institutions, there's a huge admissions boost for playing lacrosse or squash or rowing crew. Now, those are sports that are disproportionately places where you see fewer students of color. So that's a built-in advantage for more affluent students and for whiter students. Many of these institutions have legacy admission preferences. Again, a huge advantage for affluent students and white students. So we really need to reevaluate our admissions process and say, if we want universities to be civic institutions, their student bodies have to be representative of our American population. We shouldn't have universities where you have more students from the top 1% of income than the bottom 50% of income.
And we have another question from the audience. Naning Lin says, while it is important to talk about what school systems and government should do to support students' learning, can you also talk about what parents can do to facilitate their children's learning?
Sure, it's an important question and challenging because parents are very differently positioned to support their kids' learning. If you look at our workforce, only about 1 in 5 African Americans in the workforce can work from home. Only about 1 in 6 Latinos in the workforce can work from home. Many low-income families have borne a disproportionate share of the burden from this economic crisis, lost jobs, lost income, food insecurity, and housing insecurity. So all of that is competing for folks' time and attention, mental energy, so that people are differently situated. Now, that said, we do need parents as partners with educational institutions. We want parents to be supporting their kids academically, reading to their kids, helping their kids when they need academic support, in close communication with teachers. And all of that has taken on more importance in this period of online and hybrid learning. But again, it's a place where we've seen the equity gaps widen because of less access for those families that are struggling with the consequences of the economic crisis.
And there's a concern that this will all become cyclical, right? That we'll talk about the issues, that there will be a federal commission, a blue ribbon commission, whatever it might be, assembled. They'll issue a report, but there won't actually be any action or policies implemented. How do we prevent this? And 6 months to a year from now, what will you be looking at as sort of the markers of progress?
Yeah. Look, we got to organize and we have to make demands of the system to address these inequities. Adam, what your question makes me think about is, last spring, we had all these institutions put out statements of solidarity with the struggle for racial justice. All these institutions saying they believe Black Lives Matter, higher ed institutions, foundations, corporations. But how much substantive action have we seen? How much substantive change has there been? If you're a higher ed institution and you under-enroll African-American students, you don't have African-American faculty, you haven't built African-American authors and literature and historical contributions into your curriculum, how serious are you about this message that Black Lives Matter? And we have people saying they're very concerned about these equity gaps. Will they deliver? Some things we should look at. Do the resources come? Does Congress take action on the president's proposed stimulus? Do states follow through and make sure that the resources get to the highest needs districts? Are the highest needs districts able to provide tutoring, and summer, and help their students make up the academic ground that they've lost? Are students getting the socio-emotional supports they need? There was one recent survey that I heard about from students in California, student organizers, where they were showing a very low percentage of students could identify a teacher in their high school with whom they had a strong positive relationship. That's worrisome. We should be looking at indicators of students' level of connection with their teachers and peers. So we don't want to look only at academic indicators. We also want to look at school climate indicators, but we've got to ask ourselves, and you're right to say 6 months, we've got to ask ourselves regularly, are we doing enough to ensure for every kid the kind of opportunities we would want for our own?
Yeah. And final question, do you think kind of free college, universal 3K kind of fit into this conversation of closing those equity gaps? And if so, can you just kind of talk a little bit about how they factor in?
Yeah, look, it's the question of what kind of society do we want to be? And I deeply believe that this moment, this COVID recovery moment, ought to be a New Deal moment where we ask ourselves, how do we build a more just future? To me, that would mean universal access to high quality early childhood education, not just pre-K for 4-year-olds or pre-K for 3-year-olds, but also high quality childcare for infants through 2-year-olds, where the workforce is well paid. If we're serious about building an equitable society, we ought to make those investments early. We ought to have an equitable K through 12 system, and then we ought to make college debt free. Now, free tuition can be a component of that strategy, but it can't be the whole strategy because, again, the cost of college isn't just tuition. It's books, fees, housing, food, transportation, childcare. So we have to have a strategy that says, if you attend a public higher ed institution in the United States, you should be able to graduate with a 4-year degree without carrying debt with you going forward. And we've got to do something about those who are already saddled with debt that in some cases has kept them from buying a house or even from completing the degree. So we have to challenge ourselves to build the kind of society we want. Last point, in the last year, the 650 wealthiest billionaires in America have gotten more than $1 trillion richer. This is a question of how we want to organize our society. Do we want to be a society where the 650 wealthiest billionaires get $1 trillion richer and other folks can't eat, don't have housing, aren't able to get access to a quality education? Or do we want to be a society that truly lives up to the promise of equality of opportunity?
Well, John, thank you so much for a fantastic conversation. And now we'll hear from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Because of the pandemic, many of our students who were on track to attend college in the fall face a state of uncertainty.
College Advising Corps' mission is to increase the number of first-gen, low-income, and underrepresented students entering and completing college. We take recent college graduates, many of whom are first generation themselves, and we place them as near peer mentors with students who need to hear those words we all need to hear, which is, I believe in you.
COVID-19 has been incredibly disruptive. Fortunately, College Advising Corps was able to pivot to a virtual advising model. But we also soon realized that we could take this opportunity to reach other students we didn't previously serve. With support from the Gates Foundation and other partners, we were able to join together with Common App and Admit Hub to reach an additional 173,000 students across the country.
My job isn't to provide these students with different opportunities, it's to make them aware of the opportunities that are already there in place for them.
As an organization and as a country, we're in an incredibly important inflection point because now we're talking about, does every student have the opportunity he or she deserves? Does the system work for everybody? If it doesn't, how do we make the system better?
We want to say thanks again to our underwriter, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Now I'd like to bring into the conversation Dr. Sonia Santelises, CEO of Baltimore City Public Schools, and Dr. Mildred Garcia, President of the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, to discuss implementing solutions. For the first time in a long time, we have a broad consensus among parents, teachers, administrators, and policymakers that education reform from pre-K to higher ed is urgent. And as a nation, we are more clear-eyed about this because of what the pandemic has revealed, disparities that were already acceptable getting worse. So Dr. Santelises, I'll go to you first. How do we build back our education system with equity and quality of opportunity for all at its core?
I think that is the question of the season. And really, a lot of that is connected to our willingness to really grapple with what are the things that we need to be doing differently, probably should have been doing differently prior to the pandemic that we now have the opportunity to build on. So, what looks different about the way that we incorporate parent voices and a much more robust presence, frankly, of parents in the educational investment in their young people? What does it mean about how we use time? What does it mean about where we direct resources? What does it actually take to lift a different way of building relationships between young people and adults so that there's more investment in their success? So I do think that this moment could pass, as I think we heard from John King right before this. We could pass and decide not to seize the opportunity, or we can really begin doing some of the hard work to make some of those structural shifts that, frankly, have been off for quite some time.
Thank you. And Dr. Garcia, you've had success increasing graduation rates and shrinking achievement gaps with your students in the past. What are your thoughts on building back better with equity for all in higher education?
Our institutions need to really know their communities in their language and in their space. Know who is in your area. These are stewards of place, they're in the community. So, the first thing the institution needs to see is, are you serving the population you say you're going to serve in your mission and in your vision, which is your community? Secondly, they've got to really look at the policies that they have in place. For example, I found at one of my institutions that just because you didn't have $50 or $25 because of a book you didn't return, you couldn't register. Things that really are barriers. What are those barriers that are really hurting the first gen students of color and low income, who are the new majority of America. They got to look deeply. Are they hiring faculty of color? Why or why not? Why are they not growing their own, as Dr. King spoke about? Or why are they not doing proactive recruitment, especially as well as faculty, but support services, your advisors, your career specialists? We have to transform how we think about higher ed. Poor students come to college because they want a job. We make them fall in love with education. And so, how do we make that connection from what they're learning, becoming educated citizens, and their first career, and help them get into that first career or go on to graduate school? So, they have to do some deep learning. And as Dr. King really said, are they really true to the issue of equity?
Well, let's talk a little bit more about money because a large body of credible research indicates that money spent wisely on schools increases student achievement. But schools in the US are among the most inequitably funded in the industrialized world. So, if schools aren't equitably funded, are we just going to be tinkering around the edges of meaningful change? Um, Dr. Santelises, I'll start with you.
Well, I will say we are not going to get the leverage that we could get in this area if we don't have the sort of funding to do. So I'm very fortunate to be in a state where the community mobilized around trying to really address inequitable funding of schools in Baltimore City. We see it in our aged buildings. So, what this means in real practical terms is we had to use a greater proportion of our CARES money from the federal government that was to go into really supporting the additional obligations on school districts during this pandemic. Well, in Baltimore City, because our school portfolio has been underfunded for decades, what this meant was that we had to take greater portion of our CARES funding to spend it on things like HEPA air purifiers because a lot of our schools still have windows that don't open or we're already challenged with HVAC. And so we had to spend a greater proportion of the money now to rectify a lack of funding in the past. Fortunately, within the state of Maryland, you saw mobilization amongst our legislature, among grassroots organizations, even students themselves, when it came to the passage of the Kerwin legislation. And so we do have to tackle money, but it's also how money is spent. More money without a real strategic deployment of those resources is not going to yield the gains we want. So it's not an either or, which I like saying. It's not either or, it is both and. It is making up for the funding gaps and then using that funding in strategies and deployment that we know actually does increase student achievement.
Right. Dr. Garcia, what are your thoughts on this from the higher ed perspective, especially during a year when the pandemic has crushed state budgets?
Especially now, I think about our state colleges and universities, and when you think about who is serving the most vulnerable, the low income first gen students of color, these institutions are the ones that are being hurt the most. We all know that state colleges and universities, when there is a recession, when there is pandemic issues, the first thing that they cut is higher ed. So we need to really work together and build coalitions to work with our legislators. And we are thankful that now we have a Secretary of Education and Secretary Cardona, who is a first generation student, who went to an ASCU institution that understands what our students are going through. But like Dr. Santalis, we have to make sure that, yes, we work for that funding and fight for that funding, and also try to get more funding to those institutions that serve the most vulnerable, but also look within. Higher ed is known for it. I'm going to say this, and it may be controversial. We like to add things, but we have to start really thinking through what is it that we should not have in order to be able to serve our new majority.
Well, as you both mentioned, the vast majority of students who are hurt by these inequities are students of color. So it's impossible to have this conversation without talking about race. On average, children of color have less access to experienced teachers, and they end up in the most crowded classrooms. As we're looking to build back better, how do we make the school system anti-racist?
So I would
Dr.
say at least,
Garcia?
oh,
Oh,
I
go
would
ahead, Dr.
invite.
Santalisi.
Oh, go ahead, Santa Liz. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Mm.
Dr. Garcia, you go ahead. It's fine.
So I would say, first of all, you have to put equity at the center and think about who it is you're serving and how do faculty say sometimes, oh, but are you trying to lower standards? No, we're trying to set the standards high, but help students reach those standards. And so we give them the tools by having the support services, by understanding their needs and where they need to go with their education, by making sure that we are dealing with what they're dealing with. Right now, our students are very worried about their emotional well being. What is it that we have on our campuses or partner with our communities? Because they're food insecure, because their parents have lost jobs, because they have all this anxiety of not having enough money to get through college and having this dream. And so institutions need to put that at the center if they're true to equity. It's not the statements, as Dr. King said, and it's not saying pretty words. It's in the actions that the institution takes and hold
Right.
people accountable.
Dr. Santalisis?
No, well, I would just second everything that Dr. Garcia said and say that the same applies within a kindergarten through 12th grade setting as well. One of the things that we know, and I think Melinda Anderson had a fabulous piece in the New York Times months ago where she talked about the large numbers of Black students and Black families who, ironically, during the pandemic, were feeling less anxiety, less pressure, because they were not subject to school cultures that actually had long excluded, in this particular case, Black students, but I would say Black and Brown students. And so part of what the reckoning is going to require is making sure that we look at, as Dr. Garcia said, what are the policies and practices that we need to change regardless of whether the pandemic was in place, because a lot of this existed prior to, at least in our case, March, where we had to close down physical school. And so these questions of safe spaces, these questions of anti-racist spaces, and I would say uplifting, even in the curriculum we're teaching, the interactions with adults that are affirming of a national narrative that is inclusive rather than being narrow, right? One that actually uplifts the contributions of the students that, as Dr. Garcia said, really are the focus of many of our institutions. We say that we're focused, but then young people cannot see themselves. They don't see themselves verified. They're not built into what they're studying. And frankly, I heard a lot of that from young people during the protests late last spring and summer, where it was an eruption of some of the negative experiences they had been having all along. It's just the pandemic and just exacerbated what they had been experiencing all along.
All right, let's talk about the students in the Baltimore City schools. 80,000, 76% of whom are Black, 13% Latinx, two communities that were hardest hit by the pandemic's health and economic crisis. How have you dealt with the overwhelming challenges this brings to school? And has anything worked so well that you'll keep doing it post-pandemic? Things that other districts could try too. And I think you touched on this a bit. Is there anything worth getting rid of?
No, you're absolutely right, and it is the question we are disciplining ourselves to continue to ask. So first, we found far more effective ways to engage families when we had to rely on technology. Now, clearly, technology access to broadband is an incredible hurdle, not only in Baltimore City with our families, but in many communities of color across the country and underserved communities across the country. But what that did do is give our teachers, our educators, a lens into families that they previously did not have. And what that meant was we got, comments from teachers that, actually, I have to say, I saw a new side of families, families that care about their young people, families that actually are invested in their young people doing well. So, one of the things we've had conversations about is how do we leverage that family voice that we were able to tap into during this time and really carry that over. We've had some experiences getting some of our most effective teachers to students that need them most. And we know, at least in K-12 education, all of the research and data points to that the young people most in need of the most skilled teachers often are not the ones that get to receive that teaching. So, one of the things we're looking at now is how we use technology to bridge that gap and create greater access to, Dr. Garcia's field in terms of dual enrollment. We had young people who were incarcerated who enrolled in college level courses and did far better in those courses than they did in some of their experiences in Baltimore City schools. So we're really trying to look and say, what are the silver linings of this time? What are the learnings? And how do we adjust how we do business?
Right. And Dr. Garcia, the ASCU represents over 400 colleges and universities with campuses that are urban, suburban, rural, facing all sorts of different challenges. Same question, what changes have yielded positive results for your students and what's clearly not working?
I think the technology is both good and bad, right? Because they were able to continue to learn, but at the same time, we saw in a study by Strata that 3 in 10 of the students are saying they are learning worse online. So, what are the support services that we need? What is the faculty development that we must really have? Because in some institutions, they have not had a full online program and they immediately turned online. Do they have the skills to transfer what they are teaching in person to online? Do they have the technology to learn online? Those things are very, very important. What has been really good is that ASCU institutions are reaching out to students and families and listening to the voices. What is it that they need? I have examples of presidents and cabinets actually delivering laptops and hotspots to students who couldn't get to campus and needed it because A, they didn't have a laptop, and B, they couldn't afford the Wi-Fi expenses, as Dr. Santali said. So those are the caring, the empathy, understanding the students you serve has to remain in order to understand this new student. We no longer have these 17 to 21 that the parents supported and the families were working and they were able to study all the time. We have students who work, have children, live in a multi-generational home and have a lot of responsibilities. We've got to transform in higher ed.
We have a question from the audience. Thank you. Marjorie Longman asks, what would you think of using capable active seniors to aid the schools? Many are retired teachers looking for ways to give back on a volunteer basis.
At higher ed, we do that through something called the OLLI program, where they do come in and help. And they do it on a volunteer basis. They're trained on our campuses. A lot of ASCU institutions have this program. They come, they do advising, or they help the student with some tutoring, or they even give them professional advice, because many of these seniors are really excellent professionals who have retired. So we do that, and I think it's an excellent idea.
Yes, agreed. And I would say that what we have really tried to do is use this opportunity to leverage what we know in the research around tutoring, particularly for early readers, particularly for students in transition grades. And it's been a great chance to build even stronger relationships with those former teachers and with seniors in our community who even within distance tutoring can make a difference. So we are seeing success with that and definitely think it's a resource we need to use more often.
Great. I want to ask you both about the path to college because it looks a lot different now, especially for students who have suffered in the economic downturn. We know that College enrollment data shows that after years of gains, there's been a significant drop in Black and Latinx students this fall. Dr. Garcia, we know that the AASCU has partnered with the American Association of Community Colleges on something called an Equity Transfer Initiative. Can you tell us more about that project?
Yeah, it's helping institutions work together collaboratively in order to ensure that the transfer is seamless. Is ensuring, for example, we sent out a statement with APLU, ASCU, and AACC, as well as the others, to talk to institutions about how to really be a little bit more flexible during this pandemic, right? To make sure that the transfer situation is seamless. The other thing that some institutions are doing is putting faculty from community college and also senior colleges to sit together by math areas, by curriculum areas, so that they create the seamless path for those students. The other thing that was happening is that in California, for example, the California State University system has given out this pamphlet that shows parents and families from sixth grade all the way to college what they have to take every year in order for them to be able to enter the CSU. And so there are all different strategies where we're working together in order to ensure that from K 12 through community colleges up to higher ed, there is a seamless path because many families don't really know that path. And we need to be the educators because parents are really concerned about getting their children into post secondary degree.
That's right. Now, Dr. Santelises, what have you been seeing in terms of college enrollment from the Baltimore schools, and what specific resources might help more seniors transition to college during this pandemic?
So it's funny that you asked this question because I just left a budget meeting prior to this where we're really asking this question. And one of the things that we're going to be building on and actually partnering with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation around is some of our, believe it or not, ninth grade work. Because one of the things that we found is that just did not have a plan, didn't have a plan, as Dr. Garcia said, did not know the trajectory of what they needed to do to actually end up in college, which was the goal for many of our young people. But specifically for seniors, one of the things that we're investing in using some of our CARES dollars is far more one on one mentorship and counseling of seniors specifically now about their post secondary plan. So for some of our young people, it is going to be trying to attend a 4 year college and knowing what that looks like. But for many others of our young people, frankly, they've been out working. The immediate needs of their families actually put the value proposition before them of do we eat today by working for $15 an hour with Amazon, or do I continue to do schoolwork? And so one of the things we've been doing is actually going to young people and families, trying to get more flexible programming so that they don't have to make choices between livelihood and planning, and then letting them know that we're here for them and matching them with at least one caring adult who can help them navigate what really can seem like a very daunting landscape without a pandemic that now just looks 10 times as difficult and 10 times as impossible. But we've found that that kind of matching and direct feedback and guidance really helps keep young people connected to those dreams. So we're going to be doubling down our investment in that.
I just want to get your quick final thoughts on this. A new education secretary has been confirmed this week. Dr. Miguel Cardona is a former teacher and principal himself and of Puerto Rican descent. One of the new administration's goals is delivering large infusions of federal dollars to the schools. Is this encouraging?
It's incredibly encouraging. And I think what we're all going to benefit from, particularly for those of us who serve large numbers of underserved children from underserved communities is the fact that Dr. Cardona has been very, very clear, even from his nomination, that he is about equity. He is about using the full force of the federal support for education and his office to really advocate for our most needy young people. And frankly, his track record speaks to that. So you don't have to wonder. He has the experience to do that. And I'm just encouraged in the early days of this administration how he has been talking about targeting some of our most vulnerable communities and making sure that we have what we need.
I am going to say I'm also extremely encouraged and proud as a Puerto Rican. But besides that, he graduated from an ASCU institution. He is a first generation college student. He's speaking about equity at the center and continues to speak about equity at the center. I had the privilege of meeting with him, with the other higher ed organizations, the six of us. And I will say that he is not only about equity and voice, he is about accountability. And so I am extremely encouraged that from P to college, we're going to have a secretary that is going to fight for equity at the center.
Well, Dr. Santelises, Dr. Garcia, we're going to leave it there. A perfect place to end this conversation on a positive note. Thank you both for joining us, and thank you for watching. We hope today's program was a valuable experience for you. Please take a moment to share your thoughts with us about this event by completing our survey. Your input is very important in helping us shape future events. You can find a link to complete the survey in the chat. You'll also receive a link directly to your inbox following the conclusion of this broadcast. Thanks again for watching, and we hope to see you at one of our next events.